Hey everybody, this is chapter 7 of David Ryazanov's Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, an introduction to their lives and work. The topics covered in this chapter include the crisis of 1857-8, the growth of the labor movement in England, France, and Germany, the London International Exposition in 1862, the Civil War in America, the Cotton Famine, the Polish Revolt, the founding of the First International, the role of Marx, the inaugural address. We pointed out in the previous chapter that almost 10 years had gone by before the revolutionary labor movement began to recover from its defeat of 1848-49. We showed that the beginning of this recovery was bound up with the crisis of 1857-58, which was assuming international proportions and which even affected Russia in a very pronounced form. We indicated how the ruling classes of Europe, outwardly peaceful up to that time, were forced to undertake anew the solution of all those problems which were put forward by the revolution of 1848 and never solved. The most important problem pressing for a solution was that of nationalism, the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, the formation of united Germany. We mentioned briefly the fact that this revolutionary movement was, strictly speaking, limited only to Western Europe and influenced strongly only a part of England, but that it failed to reach the major part of Europe, Russia, and the faraway United States. In Russia at that time, the burning question of the day was the abolition of serfdom. It was the so-called period of, quote, great reforms, when the movement began, which, towards the early 60s, shaped itself into those underground revolutionary societies, the foremost of which was the so-called Land and Freedom Society. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States, the question of the abolition of slavery was being pressed for solution. This question, even in a greater measure than the similar one in Russia, showed how really international the world had become, the world which used to be thought of in terms of a limited part of Europe. A problem so far removed as that of the abolition of slavery in the United States became of the utmost importance to Europe itself. Indeed, so important did it become that Marx, in his foreword to the first volume of Capital, stated that the war for the abolition of slavery sounded the tocsin for the new labor movement in Western Europe. We shall begin with the most important labor movement, the English. Of the old revolutionary Chartist movement, there was nothing left by 1863. Chartism was dead. Indeed, some historians maintain that it died in 1848, right after the famous experiment of the abortive demonstration. But actually, Chartism had one more period of bloom in the 50s during the Crimean War. Owing to the leadership of Ernest Jones, who lived from 1819 to 1868, a splendid orator and a brilliant journalist who had built up the assistance of Marx and Marx's friends, the best socialist organ of those times, Chartism was able to utilize the discontent of the masses of workers during the Crimean War. There were months when the People's Paper, the central organ of the Chartists, was one of the most influential papers. Marx's masterly articles directed at Gladstone and particularly at Palmerston were attracting universal attention. But this was only a temporary revival. Soon after the conclusion of the war, the Chartists lost their organ. The cause lay not only in the factional dissensions which flared up between Jones and his opponents. There were more basic causes. The first cause was the amazing efflorescence of English industry, which had begun as far back as 1849. The minor irritations which were occurring during this period, irritations in separate branches of industry, did not in the least interfere with the general rise of industry as a whole. The vast number of unemployed at the end of the 40s was completely dissolved in this great industrial overflow. It may well be said that for many decades, nay for centuries, English industry was not in so great a need of workers as after the first half of the 19th century. The second cause was the powerful wave of emigration from England to the United States and Australia, where inexhaustible gold mines were discovered between the years 1851 and 1855. In the course of a few years, 2 million workers emigrated from England. As is usual in such cases, the emigrants were not drawn from among the children and the aged. The healthiest, most energetic, and the strongest elements were leaving England. The working class movement and the Chartist movement were being drained of the reserve from which they were drawing their strength. These were the two primary causes. There were also a number of secondary causes. Concurrent with the weakening of the Chartist movement, there was a general loosening of the ties which held the various branches of the movement together. Even in the 40s, a struggle had been going on between the trade union and the Chartist movements. Now, after forms of the working class movement too developed separatist tendencies, now other forms of the working class movement too developed separatist tendencies and were attempting to desert the parent trunk. The cooperatives, for example, were developing on the basis of certain historical conditions of the English labor movement. This peculiarity of the English labor movement was becoming well defined in the 1850s. We often encounter in its history various special organizations of sudden rapid growth and of still more sudden and still more rapid decay. Some of these organizations comprised hundreds of thousands of members. One, for instance, had as its goal the abolition of drunkenness. The Chartist organization was always following the line of least resistance. At first, it tried to conduct the war against alcohol within the boundaries of party organizations. It then began to view it as a special goal. It organized special societies all over England, thus diverting from the main labor movement a number of battalions. Besides the teetotaler movement, there was the cooperative movement led by the so-called Christian socialists. Joseph Stevens, who lived from 1805 to 1879, the famous revolutionary minister, was one of the most popular orators of the 40s, but he subsequently turned considerably to the right. Stevens was joined by a number of similar elements drawn from among philanthropists and well-wishers who were preaching practical Christianity to the workers. This indicated the decline of the Chartist movement as a political factor. It devoted itself to the forming of cooperative societies. Since the movement was not menacing to the ruling classes, it was helped even by members of the governing party. Several members of the intelligentsia who commiserated with the working classes attached themselves to the movement. Thus, in pursuit of its special aims, another branch of the working class broke away. We shall not enumerate the different forms and ramifications of these movements. Let us examine the trade unions. True, at the beginning of the 50s, the trade union movement did not meet with conditions as favorable to its development as did the cooperatives and the teetotaler movements. Nonetheless, it encountered less resistance than had the old Chartist movement. In 1851, the first stable union of the English machine-making trades was organized. This union was headed by two energetic workers who succeeded in repressing the typically English craft spirit according to which it was customary to form trade unions within the confines of one or two towns, or at most one or two counties. We should not, of course, overlook the peculiarities of English industry. It was difficult to transform the union of textile workers into a national union for the simple reason that the major part of the textile industry was concentrated in a very small area. Almost all the textile workers in England were huddling together in two counties. Thus, a two-county union was equivalent to a national union. The chief trouble of the English trade unions was due not so much to their local limitations as to their craft traditions. Each separate craft within the same industry was invariably prone to organize an independent union. This was why trade unionism was unable, despite its vigorous start, to create forms of organization equal to the task of directing a struggle against the owners of large-scale industries. While industry was flourishing, the overwhelming majority of the workers easily won increased wages. What is more, since there were not enough workers to fill the needs of the expanding new industries, the owners, in order to attract more workers, competed among themselves and were therefore ready to meet the workers more than halfway. The English capitalists, during these years, tried to lure workers from the continent, Germans, Frenchmen, Belgians, into their country. Under such circumstances, the trade union movement, despite its growth, was bound to remain on a lower plane of development. Separate trade unions, which were formed in different subdivisions of one and the same branch of industry, remained disconnected, not only within the boundaries of the whole country, but even within the confines of one town. There were not even any local councils. The crisis of 1857-58 brought vast changes into this atmosphere. As we have seen, the best organized trade union was the Union of the Skilled Machine-Making Workers. Like the textile industry, the manufacture of machines was one of those few industries which did not produce exclusively for the home market. Beginning with the 50s, the manufacture of textiles and machines became the privileged branches of industry, for they maintained a monopoly on the world market. The skilled workers in these industries easily won concessions from the employers who were reaping enormous profits. Thus it was that in the two branches of industry, conditions of, quote, civil peace between the workers and the employers were beginning to be established. The effects of the very acute crisis were rapidly disappearing. The gulf separating the skilled from the unskilled workers was becoming even wider, ever wider. This, in its turn, had debilitating results on any strike movement in these industries. Still, not all the workers were so pacific. The crisis was chiefly reflected on the building trades and on the workers engaged in these trades. Henceforth, the workers in the building trades occupied the first ranks in the struggles of the English workers. The growth of capitalism brought in its train an unprecedented swelling of the urban population and consequently a greater demand for living quarters. Hence the great boom in the building industries. In the 40s, England was in the throes of a railroad fever. In the early 50s, a building fever took its place. Houses were built by the thousand. They were in every sense of the word thrown upon the market like any other commodity. The building business, though as yet little developed technically, had already fallen into the hands of big capitalists. The English building contractors would rent a large plot of land upon which he would build hundreds of houses which he would either rent or sell. The development of the building industry lured a multitude of workers from the villages, woodworkers, carpenters, painters, masons, paper changers, in brief, all kinds of workers who were engaged in the building, decorating, and furnishing of homes. With the growth of building, there was a corresponding boom in the furniture, paper hanging, and artistic trades. The increase in the population gave impetus to the development of large-scale shoemaking and clothing industries. Thus, the crisis of 1857 to 58 had a particularly strong repercussion in these new branches of capitalist production. Great masses were left without work, and a reserve army of unemployed, which made its pressure felt on the workers in the shops and factories, was formed. The employers on their part did not hesitate to make use of this weapon to oppress the workers, to cut down their wages and lengthen the working day. But the workers, to the great surprise of their employers, answered this with a general strike in 1859, which became one of the greatest strikes London had ever known, or the greatest strikes London had known. As if further to increase the surprise of the employers, the strike of the building trades found strong support in other bodies of workers in all branches of industry. This strike attracted the attention of Europe no less than the important political events of that day. In connection with it, many meetings and miscellaneous gatherings took place. Among the speakers, we often come across the name of Kremer. At a meeting in Hyde Park, Kremer declared that the strike of the building trades is but the first skirmish between the economics of labor and that of capital. Other workers, such as George Odger, who lived from 1820 to 1877, for instance, also carried on much propaganda work. Leaflets as well played a part in the agitation. Thus the famous colloquy between the laborer and the capitalist found in the first volume of Capital, one of the most brilliant pages of that book, is in places almost a word-for-word repetition of one of the propaganda leaflets printed by the workers during the strike of 1859 to 1860. As a result of this strike, which soon ended in a compromise, there arose in London for the first time the Trades Council, at the head of which stood the three chief leaders, Odger, Kremer, and George Howe. They are also the ones whom we meet at the first General Council of the First International. Already in 1861, this London Trades Council had become one of the most influential labor organizations. At the same time, like the first Soviets, it was taking on a political character. It endeavored to react to all the events affecting the working class. Using this as a model, similar trade councils were formed in many other places in England and Scotland. Thus, in 1862, class organizations of workers again came into being. These trades councils were the outstanding political and economic centers of the day. When we turn to France, we see that the crisis there was no less severe. It reacted strongly not only on the textile industry, but also in all the other industries for which Paris was then famous. We have already mentioned the fact that the purpose of the war undertaken by Napoleon in 1859 was to sidetrack this growing discontent of the working class. Towards the beginning of the 60s, this crisis affected especially those specifically Parisian trades known as the artistic trades. But Paris was also an important urban center. It had been undergoing a strong and steady development. One of the major reforms carried through by Napoleon was the rebuilding of several residential districts in Paris. Old narrow streets were raised, various avenues were laid out, making the erection of barricades less impossible. This building activity brought about the same results here as it had in London, namely, an enormous increase in the number of workers engaged in the building trades. Indeed, is these building trades, which, with their various subdivisions ranging from the unskilled to the highly skilled on the one hand, and the workers engaged in the manufacture of articles of luxury, the representatives of the artistic trades on the other hand, who supplied the rank and file for the new mass labor movement that unfolded itself in the early 60s. One need only examine in detail the history of the First International to notice at once that the majority of its members and leaders came from the ranks of the skilled workers in both the building and artistic trades. Along with this revival of the labor movement came the awakening of the old socialist groups. On the first plane, one must notice the Proudhonists. Proudhon was still alive. He had at one time been imprisoned, then he migrated to Belgium where he exerted a certain influence on the labor movement directly as well as through his followers. But the ideas which he now preached differed somewhat from the ideas he had held at the time of his polemics with Marx. Now it was an altogether peaceful theory adapted to the legalized labor movement. The Proudhonists aimed at a general betterment of the workers' lot, and the means offered were to be adapted chiefly to the conditions of skilled workers. Their chief aim was the reduction of credit rates, or the establishment of free credit, if possible. They recommended the organizing of credit associations for the purpose of mutual aid, hence the name mutualists. Mutual aid societies, no strikes of any sort, the legalization of worker societies, free credit, no participation in any immediate political struggles, a desire to better one's lot by using only the economic struggle as the weapon. Moreover, this weapon was not to be considered as directed against the foundations of capitalist society. This, in brief, was the program of the mutualists of that day, who in several instances were more moderate than their teacher. Alongside of this group, we find an even more conservative group. It tried to buy the workers by means of sops. Armand Levy, the journalist, who had once been closely connected with the Polish political emigrants, was the leader. He was in close relation with the same Prince Plon, whom we already know as the patron of Herr Vogt. The third, the least numerous, made up of revolutionists, was the group of Blanquists, who had by then resumed their work among the workers as well as among the intelligentsia and student youth. Among these were Paul Lafargue, who lived from 1811 to 1877, and Charles Longuet, both of whom subsequently became Marx's sons-in-law. Here was also the now famous Georges Clemenceau. All these young people and workers were under the strong influence of Blanqui. The latter, though in prison, kept up lively intercourse with the outside world. He had frequent interviews with representatives of these youths. Blanquists were not implacable foes of the Napoleonic Empire. Blanquists were the most implacable foes of the Napoleonic Empire. Big difference there. My mistake could have fucked up the whole thing. And imprisoned underground revolutionists. Jesus Christ, and impassioned underground revolutionists. I'm a fucking mess. Such was the state of the working class movement in England and in France in 1862. A series of events then took place which brought about a closer rapprochement between the French and the English workers. Outwardly, the arrangement of the World Exposition in London served as the occasion for this rapprochement. This international exposition was the result of the new stage in capitalist production, giant industries which tended to knit separate countries into living parts of world economy. The first exposition was arranged after the February Revolution. It took place in London in 1851, the second in Paris in 1855, the third again in London. In connection with this exposition, there was started in Paris serious agitation among the workers. The group which was headed by Armand Levy turned to Prince Plon, who was the chairman of the commission which was to organize the French department of the London Exposition. The prince kindly arranged for the granting of subsidies to a delegation of workers which was to be sent to the London Exposition. Bitter controversies arose among the Paris workers. The Blanquists, of course, insisted on rejecting this government favor. Another group, in which the mutualists were preponderant, entertained a different opinion. According to them, it was necessary to utilize all legal possibilities. Money was to be given to subsidize a workers' delegation. They demanded that the delegation, instead of being appointed from above, should be elected in the workshops. They proposed to utilize these elections for propaganda purposes and for the pressing of their own candidates. The second group was finally victorious. Elections were permitted, and the delegation was chosen almost entirely from among the members of this group. The Blanquists boycotted the elections. The followers of Armand Levy were completely swamped. Thus was the working men's delegation from Paris organized. It is significant that the German delegation to London was connected with the group of workers who were active with Lassalle in the organization of a labor congress. In this manner, the World Exposition at London created an opportunity for the French, English, and German workers to come together. Some historians of the international trace its beginnings to this event. Here's what Steklov writes of it, quote, "The occasion of the rapprochement and the agreement between the English and the continental workers was the World's Exposition of 1862 in London. On August 5, 1862, the English workers staged a reception in honor of the 70 French delegates. The dominant note in the speeches was the necessity of establishing international ties among the proletarians who, as men, as citizens, and as toilers, had identical interests and aspirations." End quote. Unfortunately, this is mere legend. As a matter of fact, this meeting bore an entirely different character. It took place with the participation and approval of the representatives of the bourgeoisie and the ruling classes. The speeches delivered there offended not even one employer, disturbed not even one policeman. Those of the English capitalists who had been at the head of the contractors during the strikes in the building trades were the very ones who took an active part in this meeting. Suffice it to say, the English trade unionists demonstratively refused to take part in this affair. This meeting can under no circumstances be regarded as the origin of the International. Only one thing was true. In London, the French and German delegations were likely to meet French and German workers who had emigrated after 1848. The place where workers of various nationalities would meet in the 50s and 60s was the well-known Workers' Educational Society, which had been founded by Schapper and his friends in 1840. The tea room and the dining room of this society were situated on a street where foreigners settled. It served as such a center up to the late war. The English government hastened to close this club immediately upon the declaration of war in 1914. It was there, no doubt, that some members of the French delegation became acquainted with the old French emigrants, and that of the German workers from Leipzig and Berlin met their old comrades. But these were, of course, only incidental ties which were as unlikely to lead to the forming of the International as was the meeting of August 5th, to which Steklov, together with other historians, attaches such great importance. But now, two very important events happened, the first of which was the American Civil War that happened from 1860 to 1865. We have already seen that the abolition of slavery was the most important problem of the day. It became so acute and it had led to such an acrid conflict between the southern and northern states that the South, in order to preserve slavery, determined to secede and to organize an independent republic. The result was a war which brought in its train unexpected and unpleasant consequences to the whole of the capitalistic world. The southern states were then the sole growers of the cotton which was used in all cotton industries of the world. Egyptian cotton was still of very little importance. East India and Turkestan were not producing any cotton at all. Europe thus found itself without any cotton supply. The textile industries of the world were experiencing a crisis. The shortage of cotton caused a rise in the prices of all other raw materials in the textile industry. Of course, the big capitalists suffered, least of all. The petty capitalists hastened to shut down their factories. Tens, nay hundreds of thousands of workers were doomed to perish of hunger. Excuse me. I had to get a drink. I felt like I had like a loose cookie crumb or something in my throat. The governments confined themselves to handing out pitiful pittances. The English workers who had not long before, during the strike in the building trades, shown an example of solidarity, now too took up the cause of organizing help. The initiative belonged to the London Trades Council, which appointed a special committee. In France also there was organized a special committee for this purpose. The two committees were in frequent communication with one another. It was this that suggested to the French and English workers how closely allied were the interests of labor of different countries. The Civil War in the United States gave a terrific shock to the entire economic life of Europe. Its malignant effects were equally felt by the English, French, German, and even Russian workers. This was why Marx wrote in his introduction to Capital that the American Civil War in the 19th century played the same role with regard to the working class as the American War for Independence of the 18th century had played with regard to the French bourgeoisie and the French Revolution. Another event then occurred, which also was of equal interest to the workers of the different countries. Serfdom was abolished in Russia, 1861. Reforms in other branches of the political and economic life of Russia were imminent. The revolutionary movement became more animated. It advocated more radical changes. Russia's outlying possessions, chiefly Poland, were in a state of commotion. The Tsar's government grasped at this as the best pretext for getting rid of external as well as internal sedition. It provoked the Polish revolt, while at the same time, aided by Katkov and other venal scribes, it incited Russian chauvinism at home. The notorious hangman Muraviev, and other brutes like him were commandeered to stifle the Polish revolt. In Western Europe, where hatred for Russian Tsarism was prevalent, the rebellious Poles evoked the warmest sympathy. The English and French governments allowed the sympathizers of the Polish insurgents complete freedom of action, regarding this as a convenient outlet for the stored feelings of resentment. In France, a number of meetings were held, and a committee, headed by Henri Tolaine, who lived from 1828 to 1895, and Peruchon, was organized. In England, the Polish movement was headed by the workers, Odger and Kremer, and by the radical intellectual, Professor Beazley. In April 1863, a monster mass meeting was called in London. Professor E.S. Beazley, who lived from 1831 to 1915, presided. Kremer delivered a speech in defense of the Poles. The meeting passed a resolution which urged the English and the French workers to bring simultaneous pressure to bear upon their respective governments and to force their intervention in favor of the Poles. It was decided to provide for an international meeting. This took place in London on July 22, 1863. The chairman was again Beazley. Odger and Kremer spoke in the name of the English workers, Tolaine in the name of the French. Nothing but the Polish affair was discussed, and they all insisted on the necessity of restoring independence to Poland. On the next day, another meeting took place to which the historians of the International have not paid much attention. It was arranged on the initiative of the London Trades Council, this time without the participation of the bourgeoisie. Odger had been advocating closer ties between English and continental labor. The problem presented itself on a practical basis. For English labor had to take note of the serious competition of the French, the Belgian, and particularly the German workers. At the beginning of the 60s, the bread-baking industry, which was already concentrated into great enterprises, was wholly operated by German workers. In the building, furniture, and decorative industries, there was an influx of Frenchmen. That was why the English trade unionists valued so much any possible chance of influencing foreign laborers who were pouring into England. This could best be accomplished through an organization which would unite the workers of various nations. It was decided that the English workers send an appropriate address to the French workers. Almost 3 months elapsed while the draft of this address was being offered to the London trade unionists for approval. It was written largely by Odger. By this time, the Polish revolt had been crushed by the Tsar's henchmen with unheard-of cruelty. The address made almost no mention of it. Here is a small excerpt. Quote, "A fraternity of people is highly necessary for the cause of labor, for we find that whenever we attempt to better our social conditions by reducing the hours of toil or by raising the price of labor, our employers threaten us with bringing over Frenchmen, Germans, Belgians, and others to do our work at a reduced rate of wages, and we are sorry to say that this has been done, though not from any desire on the part of our continental brethren to injure us, but through a want of regular and systematic communication between the industrial classes of all countries. Our aim is to bring up the wages of the ill-paid to as near a level as possible with that of those who are better remunerated, and not to allow our employers to play us off against the other, and so drag us down to the lowest possible condition, suitable to their avaricious bargaining." End quote. The address was translated into French by Professor Beazley and was sent to Paris in November 1863. There it served as material for propaganda in the workshops. The French answer was very tardy. Paris was then getting ready for the forthcoming elections to the Legislative Assembly, later known as the Chamber of Deputies. A group of workers, at the head of whom we again see Tolaine and Peruchon, raised the exceedingly important question as to whether labor should nominate its own candidates or whether it should be satisfied to support the radical candidates. In other words, should labor stand on its own independent platform or should it straggle at the tail of the bourgeois parties? This question was hectically discussed at the end of 1863 and in the beginning of 1864. The workers decided to work independently and to nominate Tolaine. It could be Tolan as well. I'm not sure, though. They resolved to explain this break with the bourgeois Democrats in a special platform, which has since been known as the Manifesto of the 60, because of the number of signatures affixed to the document. The theoretical part of this manifesto, the criticism to which the bourgeois order was subjected, was in full accord with Proudhon's views. But at the same time, it definitely abandoned the master's political program by advocating a separate political party for the workers and the nomination of labor candidates for political offices to represent the interests of the workers. Proudhon greeted this manifesto of the 60 very warmly. Inspired by it, he proclaimed to write a book which turned out to be the best work he had ever written. He devoted the last months of his life to it, but he did not live to see it published. The book was called The Political Capacity of the Working Class. Here, for the first time, Proudhon acknowledged the right of the working class to form independent class organizations. Proudhon hailed the new program of the Paris workers as the best proof of the vast political potentialities stored away in the depths of the working class. Despite the fact that Proudhon did not change his stand on the question of strikes and mutual aid associations, his last book, by its spirit of protest against bourgeois society and its decidedly proletarian slant, was reminiscent of his excellent first literary work, What is Property? This justification of the working class became one of the favorite books of the French workers. When we are told of the influence of Proudhonism during the epoch of the French International, we must not forget that it was the influence of that form of Proudhonism which became crystallized after the publication of the Manifesto of the 60. That's super interesting. Almost a year passed before the workers of Paris composed their reply to the English address. A special delegation was chosen to take it to London. On September 28, 1864, a meeting to receive the French delegation was held in the famous St. Martin's Hall. Beasley presided. The hall was crowded. First, Odger read the address from the English workers. Tolaine then read the French reply, a short excerpt of which follows, quote, "Industrial progress, the division of labor, freedom of trade, these are three factors which should receive our attention today, for they promise to change the very substance of the economic life of society. Compelled by the force of circumstances and the demands of the time, capital is concentrating and organizing in mighty financial and industrial combinations. Should we not take some defensive measure? This force, if not counterbalanced in some way, will soon be a despotic power. We, the workers of the world, must unite and erect an insurmountable barrier to the baleful system which would divide humanity into two classes, a host of hungry and brutalized people on one hand and a clique of fat, overfed mandarins on the other. Let us seek our salvation through solidarity," end quote. The French workers brought with them even the project for such an organization. A central commission made up of representatives from various countries was established in London, subcommissions which were to be in constant communication with the central body, and which were to discuss questions proposed by that body, were created in all the chief cities in Europe. The central commission was to summarize the results of these discussions. An international congress was to convene in Belgium to decide upon the final form of the organization. But we might ask, where Marx was Marx? What part did Marx take in all this? No part at all. We see then that all the preparations for the historic event which took place on September 28, 1864, the day of the beginning of the First International, were the efforts of the workers themselves. Until now, we had no occasion even to mention the name of Marx in connection with this affair. Still, on this august occasion, Marx was among the invited guests on the platform. How did he happen to be there? A little note found among Marx's miscellaneous papers supplies the answer. It reads, quote, "Mr. Marx, dear sir, the committee who have organized the meeting as announced in the enclosed bill respectfully request the favor of your attendance. The production of this will admit you to the committee room where the committee will meet at 7:30. I am, sir, yours respectfully, signed, W.R. Kremer," end quote. The question arises, what prompted Kremer to invite Marx? Why was the invitation not extended to many other emigrants who crowded London at the time and who were closer to the Englishmen or the Frenchmen? Why was he chosen as a member of the committee of the future International Association? As to this, we can form only guesses. The most plausible seems to be the following. We have already seen the part that the Educational Society of the German Workers was playing in London as the central meeting place of workers of various nationalities. It became such a center to an even greater extent that the English workers themselves when the English workers themselves came to realize that it was necessary to combine with the Germans in order to counteract the harmful consequences of the competition of workers whom the English employers, through their agents, were alluring into London. Hence the close personal ties which existed between them and the members of the former Communist League, J.G. Icarius, Friedrich Lessner, and Fender. The first two were tailors, the third a painter. They were all taking an active part in the London trade union movement and were well acquainted with the organizers and leaders of the London Trades Council. It is not difficult to understand how Adler and Kremer came to know Dr. Marx, who during the affair with Vogt had renewed his relations with the German Workers' Educational Society. Marx's chief role in the First International, with the foundation of which he had nothing to do, began after it was organized. He soon became the guiding spirit of the organization. The committee that was elected by the meeting of September 28th had no instructions. There was no program, no constitution, nor even a name. There was already existing in London such an international society, the Common League, which offered its hospitality to the committee. From a reading of the minutes of the committee's first meeting, we gather that there were present also several benign bourgeois representatives of this league. Some of these gentlemen suggested to the committee that there was no need for a new organization. Others proposed the organization of a new international society which would be open not only to workers but also to anybody to whom the cause of international solidarity and the amelioration of the economic and political conditions of the toilers were dear. Only on the insistence of two working men, Icarius and Whitlock, a former Chartist, was it decided to christen the new society with the name of International Workingmen's Association. This motion was supported by the Englishmen, among whom there were a few Chartists, members of the old Workingmen's Association, the cradle of the Chartist movement. The new name unequivocally defined the distinctive character of the new international association, which forthwith shook off the well-meaning bourgeoisie who belonged to the Common League. The committee was told to look for other quarters. Fortunately, they were successful in finding a small meeting room not far from the German Workers' Educational Society, in a district populated by emigrants and foreign workers. As soon as the name was decided upon, the committee proceeded to propose the program and the statutes. There was one trouble. The committee was made up of too many different elements. There were first of all Englishmen, who were divided up into several groups themselves. There were trade unionists, former Chartists, there were even ex-Owenites. There were Frenchmen, not very great adepts at economic questions, but who considered themselves specialists along the lines of revolution. The Italians, too, were very influential, for they were headed by Giuseppe Mazzini, who lived from 1805 to 1872, the very popular old revolutionist Republican, but who was also very religious. There was also the Polish emigrants. To them the Polish question was paramount. There were, finally, several Germans, all former members of the Communist League, Icarius, Lessner, Lachner, and Fender and Marx. Various projects were brought before the committee. In the subcommittee on which he was serving, Marx propounded his theses, and it was finally resolved that he present his project before the whole committee. Finally, when the committee convened for the fourth time, November 1st, 1864, Marx's draft with a small number of editorial modifications was adopted by an overwhelming majority. We must admit at the very outset that the draft, as it was adopted, contained many compromises and concessions. Marx himself, in his letter to Engels, deplores the fact that he was forced to introduce into the Constitution and the program such words as right, morality, and justice, but as he assures Engels, he managed to insert these words in places where they would do least harm. Yet this was not what contained the secret of Marx's success. His success in having his propositions adopted almost unanimously by such a variegated group was the result of the extraordinary mastery with which the inaugural address of the International was written. This was admitted even by Bakunin, Marx's most virulent opponent. As Marx confesses in his letter to Engels, it was extremely difficult to couch the communist view in a form that would prove acceptable to the labor movement in its first crude stages. It was impossible to employ the bold revolutionary language of the Communist Manifesto. Marx endeavored to be sweeping in content yet moderate in form. His success was unequivocal. This inaugural address was written 17 years after the Communist Manifesto. These two documents were the work of the same author, yet the historical epochs in which, and the organization for which, these two manifestos were written were utterly different. The Communist Manifesto was written at the request of a small group of revolutionists and communists for a very young labor movement. These communists emphasized, even then, that they were not stressing any principles which they wanted to foist upon the labor movement, but that they were trying to crystallize those general principles which, irrespective of nationality, represented the common interests of the proletariat of the entire world. 1 second. Get some water here. Excuse me. In 1864, the labor movement grew and penetrated the masses. But as far as a developed class consciousness was concerned, it was much behind the revolutionary vanguard of 1848. A similar retrogression was also to be observed among the leaders. The new manifesto had to be written in a manner which would take into account the low level of proletarian class consciousness among the masses and the leaders, but which would at the same time adhere to the basic principles laid down in the Communist Manifesto. Marx in the address gave a classical example of, quote, united front, end quote, tactics. He formulated the demands and emphasized all the points upon which the working class could and should unite, and on the basis of which a further development of the labor movement could be expected. From the immediate proletarian demands formulated by Marx, the greater demands of the Communist Manifesto would logically follow. In all this, Marx had, of course, a colossal advantage over Mazzini, over the French revolutionists, as well as over the English socialists who were on the Committee of the International. He himself, without having changed his basic principles, accomplished a monumental piece of work. By this time, Marx had concluded the first draft of his gigantic work and was engaged in putting his finishing touches to the first volume of Capital. Marx was then the only man in the world who had made such an exhaustive study of the conditions of the working class and so profoundly grasped the whole mechanism of capitalist society. In the whole of England, there was not another man who took the infinite pains of making such a thorough study of all the reports of the English factory inspectors and the researches of the parliamentary commissions which had been investigating conditions in various branches of industry in different categories of the city and the county proletariat. City and the country proletariat, The information which Marx possessed on this subject was comprehensive and inseparably wider than that possessed by the working men members of the committee. He knew conditions in each trade and their relation to the general laws of capitalist production. The gifts of a great propagandist are shown in the very structure of the address. Just as in the Communist Manifesto, Marx began with the class struggle as the fundamental basis of all historic development and all political movements, so did he in the new manifesto begin not with general phrases nor with high-flown subjects, but with facts which characterized the conditions of the working class. Quote, "It is an extremely momentous fact that the misery of the working class in the years 1848 to 1864 has not lessened, in spite of the unexampled development of industry and growth of trade during this period." End quote. And Marx, referring to Gladstone's speech in the House of Commons, pointed out that despite the threefold increase of the trade of Great Britain since 1843, human life in 9 cases out of 10 was nothing but a hard struggle for mere existence. In fact, criminals in prison were getting better nourishment than many workers. Constantly referring to the investigations of the parliamentary commissions, Marx drew a picture of undernourishment, degeneration, and disease among the masses of the working class. At the same time, he called attention to the fabulous growth of the wealth of the property classes. Marx thus arrived at the inevitable conclusion that, notwithstanding the assertions of the bourgeois economists, neither the perfecting of the machines, nor the application of science to industry, nor the opening of new means of communication, the discovery of new colonies, emigration, the creation of new markets, nor free trade were likely to eliminate the misery of the working class. He therefore concluded further, as in the Communist Manifesto, that while the social order rested on the old foundation, Any new development of the productive powers of labor would only widen and deepen the chasm which divided the classes and would bring to the fore even more strikingly the already existing antagonism. Having pointed out the causes which had contributed to the defeat of the working class in 1848, the defeat which had brought in its train the apathy that had characterized the decade from 1849 to 1859, Marx also directed attention to a few conquests made by the workers during that period. First, the 10-hour day law. He proved that despite all the assertions of the hangers-on of capitalism, the shortening of the workday enhanced rather than impaired the productivity of labor. Moreover, Marx pointed out the triumph of the principle of government interference in economic relations over the old laissez-faire ideas. He further concluded, as he had in the Communist Manifesto, that production must be subjected to the control and the direction of society as a whole, and that such social production lay at the very basis of the political economy of the working class. The law pertaining to the 10-hour day was not merely a practical victory, it indicated the victory of proletarian political economy over the political economy of the bourgeoisie. It's a very strange word, proletarian political economy. Another achievement was the cooperative factories which were being built on the initiative of the workers themselves. But unlike the South, for whom cooperative associations were the starting point of the transformation of society into a state of socialism, Marx did not exaggerate their practical importance. On the contrary, he used these cooperatives to illustrate to the working masses that large-scale and scientific production could proceed and develop without a class of capitalists to exploit the toilers, that wage labor, like slavery, was not anything eternal, but that in point of fact it was a transitional and lower form of work which ultimately was to give place to a system of social production. Having made all the communist deductions, Marx pointed out that while these cooperative associations comprised only a small number of workers, they could not better the conditions of the working class in any way. The network of cooperative production would have to spread all over the land before capitalist production could be superseded by communist production. But having put the problem thus wise, Marx hastened to note that such a transformation would be impeded by the desperate opposition of the ruling classes. The landowners and the capitalists would use their political power to defend their economic privileges. Hence, the first duty of the working class was the conquest of political power, and, to accomplish this, the workers must create political labor parties in all countries of the world. There's only one factor of success that the workers have at their command. This is mass, numbers. But this mass is strong only when it is compact, united, and when it is guided by knowledge and science. Without compactness, without solidarity, without mutual support in the struggle for liberation, without a national and an international organization, the workers would be doomed to failure. Guided by these considerations, added Marx, the workers of various countries decided to form an international workingmen's association. Thus did Marx, with his amazing tact and skill, again arrive at the basic conclusions he had once reached in the fiery Communist Manifesto. The organization of the proletariat along class lines, the overthrow of bourgeois domination, the proletarian seizure of political power, the abolition of wage labor, the passing of all the means of production into the hands of society. Marx concluded the inaugural address with another quite important political problem. The working class must not confine itself to the narrow sphere of national politics. It must follow assiduously all the questions of external politics. If the success of the whole cause depends upon the fraternal solidarity of the workers of the world, then the working class would not fulfill its mission were it to allow the ruling classes who are in charge of international diplomacy to utilize national prejudices to set the workers of one country against the workers of other countries, to shed the blood and destroy the wealth of the people. The workers must therefore master all the mysteries of international politics. They must watch the diplomatic acts of their governments. They must resist, if need be, with all the power at their disposal. They must join in one sweeping protest against the criminal machinations of their governments. It is time to bring to an end a state of affairs which, while punishing crimes when perpetrated by individuals, permits stealing, robbing, and deceit in international relations. It's the end of Chapter 7 of David Ryazanov's Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, an introduction to their lives and work. Thank you for listening.